the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Francine Schertzer. Today we'll talk about the minimum wage in Pennsylvania. You can join our discussion by calling us at 1-877-PA6-5001 or text us at 717-219-4001. But first, we're joined by Jim Lee, president at Susquehanna Polling and Research. Jim, thanks for joining us this morning.
You're welcome, Francine. Good morning.
Good morning. Your latest poll starts off looking at whether people view Pennsylvania going in the right direction or the wrong track. 35% say the right direction, 61% the wrong track. What do you think lends to this sentiment?
Yeah, I looked at the trend line for this question. We ask it every poll for every year for the last 20 years, and very rarely do we see a majority of Pennsylvanians say the state's going the right direction. I think when they hear this question, they think of Harrisburg, they think of divided government, which we've had for so long, and as a result, they don't get the perception that the state is ever going in the right direction. I can only point to one instance in September of 2006, when a majority of Pennsylvanians said right direction to this question. It was during Governor Rendell's re-election campaign. He had dominated the airways with positive TV ads about the direction of Pennsylvania. He went on to win by 20 points that year over Lynn Swan. And that was the only time in the last 15 to 20 years when we saw a high level of optimism on this question. The other takeaway from this is 62% of Democrats, Francine, say the state's going in the wrong direction. That says to me that Governor Shapiro hasn't yet made the case that he's turned the state around, because he hasn't yet convinced a majority of his own party that Pennsylvania is moving in a new direction under a new administration.
The next question gives those polled 8 options, and they're supposed to pick the most important issues facing Pennsylvania. The top 3 were education and public schools at 42%. Crime and public safety at 41%, and inflation at 35%. So in a moment, I'll give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about why those issues rose to the top, but perhaps as an overview, do you see a correlation between the general sentiment and what's been happening with those specific issues?
I do, and I think if Governor Shapiro is looking at the results of this question, he is probably emboldened, because the number one issue in the governor's budget address was $1 billion investment in public education, $872 million of which goes to underperforming and poor school districts in the Commonwealth. You see here that education in schools is the number one issue facing the state of Pennsylvania, so he is in line with public opinion on that issue. What's perhaps also important from this question, aside from crime and public safety and inflation, but what's not rising to the level of priority, is the economy and jobs, only at 15%, which is very interesting because the job market is actually very strong according to economists. And I think you see that here, where people are making a distinction between the general economy and inflationary pressures, which are being faced by consumers day in and day out at the pump, in grocery stores, high interest rates. All those inflationary pressures are why that issue popped to 35%. Crime and public safety at 41 is another issue. We believe that's very media-driven. It's by the local news reporting who's died, who was shot, some of the violence in different communities in the state. So that's a very, very visceral reaction to, I think, what the news media is reporting.
The next question looks at Governor Josh Shapiro's job approval rating, 48% approved, 40% disapproved. How does this fare, both as a public official and perhaps compared to other governors at this stage in their term? Excellent
question. When I first looked at 48% approve, 40% disapprove, I thought, that's not really too strong. I mean, there's only an 8-point gap between approval and disapproval. Then I went back and pulled the job approval ratings for the last 3 governors a year after they've been in office. So we have an apples-to-apples comparison. Former Governor Wolf, which was Shapiro's predecessor, had a 45% approval rating after a year in office. Governor Tom Corbett, who was Wolf's predecessor, had a 45% approval rating after a year in office. Ed Rendell, after a year in office, had a 45% approval rating. So Josh Shapiro sitting with a 48% approval rating, which isn't too bad for a guy that's really been in office just over a year, but is still facing divided government in the legislature, where he knows he can't get done everything he wants to do.
The next question is President Joe Biden's job approval rating. The numbers here, 39% approved, 55% disapproved. How does this bode for the president's reelection?
Not good. 39% approval rating. To put that in perspective, former President Dwight Eisenhower in 1955, basically a year from re-election, which is basically where we are today, had a 78% approval rating. Compare that with Joe Biden at 39%. Harry Truman had a 23% approval rating. Joe Biden's at 39%. So Biden's on the lower end of the spectrum when you compare him to former presidents about a year from election day. So a 39% approval rating isn't where you want to be if you're trying to make the case that you deserve 50% of the vote. The problem is in the internals here, he's getting good support with Democrats, but with independent voters and Republicans, his approval rating is very low. So he hasn't made the case that he's governing for all of Pennsylvania or all of America, because there's still a significant amount of voters in the Republican Party and independent voters that really don't believe in the president's policies. So 39% isn't an ideal place to be with just 6 to 7 months to go before Election Day.
One last question. If voter sentiment over specific issues is impacting how they feel about the general direction of the state or perhaps their public officials, why do you think Governor Josh Shapiro has higher approval ratings than President Joe Biden?
I think to a certain extent, Josh Shapiro is just coming off of his honeymoon phase. His approval rating was in the 60% range last year. That's tapered off a little bit, but people are looking more specifically at Shapiro and giving him a higher approval rating because he's a good politician. He's articulate. He's smart. He is a former legislator who knows how to navigate the legislative process in Harrisburg. And he comes from a very vote-rich area of Pennsylvania. So when you do a statewide poll, 1 in 3 surveys, Francine, comes from the area that Josh Shapiro is from, southeastern Pennsylvania. That really does tend to prop up your approval rating in any statewide poll, because it's a really good area to come from if you're a statewide politician in Pennsylvania.
Jim Lee, thank you for joining us this morning.
You're welcome.
More of the PCN Capitol Preview after this short break. Welcome back. Our guests today are Marc Stier, Executive Director at the Pennsylvania Policy Center, and Alex Halper, Senior Vice President for Government Affairs at the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. For the 10th year in a row, the sitting Pennsylvania governor has called for an increase in the minimum wage. Alex, we'll start with you. Why has the legislature been unable to come to an agreement on this?
Well, as Jim mentioned, we're in a period of divided government. And that means you have lawmakers bringing different perspectives, and something like raising the minimum wage just brings different opinions. You have the potential impact on employers and small businesses. But I think if you really look at it, what generally unites lawmakers is the idea that if you're a low-income Pennsylvanian raising a family, there should be ways to help support you. The challenge, of course, is coming to an agreement on what that looks like. And I think you'd have a lot of lawmakers that would say, minimum wage has been around for 100 years. It is not. It's a blunt instrument. It is not a tool that really effectively targets those Pennsylvanians whom we all agree sort of need policies that support them. So we get into this annual discussion about minimum wage, and at the end of the day, it's those Pennsylvanians struggling who kind of lose out.
Marc Stier?
Well, obviously, people disagree about the minimum wage, but we think the big problem is there's too much influence of the very largest corporations over our legislators. We have a Democratic House now that has passed a plan to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour over a year or so. The plan was introduced in the Senate as well, but the Senate leadership simply won't allow that plan to come to the floor. If it came to the floor in the Senate, I'm pretty sure it would pass. And it really is long past time that we raised the minimum wage. My first job was in 1968. I was making $1.06. The minimum wage was $1.60 an hour. I was a bellhop at a hotel. Much harder work than I do today, by the way. If the minimum wage were adjusted for inflation, From $1.60 in 1968, it would be very close to $15. If we also adjusted for the increased productivity of workers in Pennsylvania, it would be $24.90 today. In 1968, a minimum wage worker could support himself and a family of 3 and lift them above the poverty line. Now, a minimum wage worker could barely keep himself or herself above the poverty line. It's really time to do this. Every state around us has raised the minimum wage. Every state around us except West Virginia is either at $15 an hour or $17 an hour in Washington, D.C., or is on a path there.
It's interesting when you think about who's impacted by minimum wage. Dr. Stier mentioned corporations. We at the PA Chamber represent businesses of all sizes. I haven't had a large corporation contact me with concerns about the minimum wage in years. It's really the very small of the small businesses. It's nonprofit organizations. When you look at the population of who's earning the minimum wage, it is a very, very small segment, about 1% of working Pennsylvanians who are at that minimum wage level. And 2/3 of those are working in restaurants and bars who are tipped employees, many of whom we know are earning well above the minimum wage. So it really is a very narrow population. You're talking small businesses. These are folks who operate on very thin profit margins. You look at the average restaurant, for example, it might be like a 1% profit margin. And the idea, some of these proposals, the bill that passed out of the House to raise the minimum wage had a particular piece related to restaurants and tipped workers that would increase costs, labor costs on restaurants by about 320%. These are restaurants that many are still kind of recovering from a very challenging few years. They're dealing with supply chain disruptions, they're dealing with inflation and workforce challenges. And they're being told to raise labor prices by 320%. It's just not, unfortunately, it's not connected with reality. And I think if lawmakers kind of came together and said, we want to help this population of workers, let's think of kind of thoughtful, strategic, targeted ways to do that, I think we could do some really good work.
Do we have any sense of how many businesses in Pennsylvania actually pay what the minimum wage currently is?
Well, we know how many workers would benefit from raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And while it's true very few workers are at $7.25 now, almost 20% of Pennsylvania's workforce would get an increase in pay if the wages went up to $15. About 750,000 would make less than $15 an hour now, but another 568,000 Pennsylvanians make a little bit above the minimum wage right now, above 15 now. They would see their wages go up. This would have a dramatically improved effect on our economy, particularly for small businesses. Now, I know every legislator knows a pizza shop owner says, well, at $15 an hour, I couldn't afford to make pizza. But that's really misleading in a couple ways. Number one, wages are only a small portion of the cost of making a pizza. Second of all, when you pay people more, they tend to stay in their jobs longer, it reduces training costs, increases morale, increases productivity. Third of all, the empirical evidence is that raising the minimum wage doesn't raise prices and put pizza shops out of business. Have you heard? In New York, they have a $15 minimum wage. Have you heard of a pizza shortage? Have you heard of a pizza shortage in Washington, D.C., where they have a $17 minimum wage? I did a little study at the end of last year. I looked at the price of Domino's Pizza in the state capitals of every state around Pennsylvania. In all those states, the average minimum wage is 69% higher than it is here. The price of pizza is 1.9% higher in those Domino's, and there's no pizza shortage. I think businesses can afford to pay more. They can afford to raise their wages, their prices just a little, and that will cover the cost of wages, largely because workers will be happier, be more productive, and they make up the difference that way.
During the budget address, Governor Shapiro referred to the $7.25 minimum wage as, quote, uncompetitive. Alex, your thoughts on that?
Well, that is that number is the focus, but we know that that's not realistically what the real minimum wage is. The state independent fiscal office puts our effective minimum wage at closer to $11. When you look at average wages in Pennsylvania, we are above the national average. policymakers, of course, we get into this annual minimum wage has become kind of a political rallying cry. It has been for decades and decades, over 100 years. We get into these discussions. Marc will point to his studies and surveys that say, you can double labor costs on businesses and everything will just work out perfectly. We'll point to our studies and surveys and say, in fact, that's not the case. If you look at the experience in other states, you look at the experience in Pennsylvania, you do see a contraction in employment. You see fewer job opportunities and the irony is when you look at the individuals who are impacted, and this is coming from the Independent Fiscal Office, this is not the PA Chamber, it is disproportionately lower income and young workers who are impacted. And that for us is very concerning long term. You think about some of the workforce challenges we're already experiencing. And at the same time, you think about how important that, first job, whether it's a summer job or, a part-time job in high school. These are the positions where, young Pennsylvanians are learning how to work, how to operate in a workplace, how to develop those skills that we hope will take them through their careers. When you kind of manipulate wage rates like this, you are reducing those opportunities for younger Pennsylvanians. And that's where the real long-term concerns come in. Are we going to have a workforce in the next 5, 10, 15 years that is qualified and prepared to work when we're making it more and more difficult for these young Pennsylvanians to find jobs?
Marc, is there data to either confirm or deny the theory that most minimum wage workers are teenagers?
They're not teachers. 84% of minimum wage workers are not teenagers. They are 60% are women, 69% of them are white. Half of them between the ages of 20 and 39. Some have children. About the same percentage live in urban areas and live in rural areas, and they would all benefit. And you know what? There's this radical organization called the New York Federal Reserve Bank. They did a study of the impact of the minimum wage on the Pennsylvania-New York border, and what they found is on the New York border, not only were wages higher, but employment was higher. Why? Because give people more money, they spend more, and that generates economic growth. In fact, lots of Pennsylvanians are crossing the border from Pennsylvania to New York to work there because they get paid more. So the idea that raising the minimum wage reduces jobs simply is not true. Now look, there's some level. You have a $100 minimum wage, we'd probably lose some jobs. But a $15 minimum wage in today's economy, that's worth less than what a minimum wage in 1968 would be when you adjust for productivity. There's no reason to think that it's going to create a problem, and it will in fact help our economy over the long term.
So the State Department of Labor and Industry just, I think a week ago or so, put out their report on who's earning the minimum wage in Pennsylvania. And they did find that the most common category for ages is teenagers. A majority are under the age of 25, and 94% of minimum wage earners don't have children. 94%. So if we can all agree that policies should focus on those low-income Pennsylvanians who are, trying to raise families under difficult circumstances, I think any objective analysis of the legislative and policy tools out there would probably say over the last 100 years, the effectiveness of the minimum wage as that poverty-fighting tool has probably eroded over the years. Back in the 30s and 40s and even the 60s, what Marc was talking about, it was much more likely that a minimum wage earner might be the breadwinner for a family. Over time, however, the data show that the age of minimum wage earners has gone down, and the likelihood that they have children or are the breadwinners for the families has gone down significantly. So you are talking about a younger population at this rate, and unfortunately the rationale and some of the talking points around this being a policy have kind of stayed the same since the 60s, even as this population of who we're talking about has changed pretty dramatically.
If I could just quickly respond. Yeah, sure. If the minimum wage is $7.25, it's not helping people that as much. And most workers at $7.25 in Pennsylvania, maybe more of them are teenagers. But a minimum wage of $15 would affect a wide swath of people who are not teenagers. So what Alex is saying is, yeah, the minimum wage doesn't work as well as it used to. to improve the lives of people. And the reason is we haven't raised the minimum wage. If we set the minimum wage at the level it was in 1968 today, relative adjusting for inflation and productivity, the minimum wage would have a dramatic impact in improving the lives of not just people who make the minimum wage, people who make more than minimum wage. Minimum wage, like labor unions, like a strong social safety net, don't just benefit people at the bottom. They help create the middle class. They've done that in the past. They can do it in the future.
A reminder to our viewers, if you'd like to join in on the discussion, you can call us toll-free, 1-877-PA6-5001, or text us 717-219-4001. Alex, are there policies that you and your organization would support that would help low-wage earners beyond increasing the minimum wage?
Yeah, we need a much more effective workforce development and job training infrastructure in Pennsylvania. I think a lot of progress has been made. We have appreciated, very much the emphasis from the Shapiro administration on improving workforce programs, but we really need to double down there. We focus so much on, issues like the minimum wage. I wish there was half as much attention on how we can train and educate Pennsylvanians for good, career-oriented jobs, of which there are so many in Pennsylvania that are unfilled. We just heard recently from the governor's budget secretary that for every 10 job openings in Pennsylvania, there are only 6 job seekers actually looking for them. We have great industries, and you look around Pennsylvania and how many employers, good jobs, are hiring, and they just can't find the people. So absolutely, we need programs that are oriented towards training. We need this kind of support infrastructure so that low-income Pennsylvanians have the ability to actually afford and attend these programs. That I think is where lawmakers' attention should really be focused.
Mark, are there additional policies you'd like to see move forward?
I'm glad to hear Alex talking about workforce development and job training programs, because we certainly agree that that's a really strong way to help working people and help businesses too, and that's really important. Raising the wages would actually help businesses right now. I grew up in a small business, and my family was always happy when they raised the minimum wage, because when we tried to pay workers above the minimum wage because we want them to be productive, we want them to stay. But there's a limit to how much you can do it because of competitive pressures. When we raise the floor and we help all businesses pay a bit more, they all benefit over the long term. Finally, I want to say there's another important policy that could help working people. There's a program at the federal level called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which gives a tax credit for working people who are paying taxes to the federal government. We could create a program in Pennsylvania that piggybacked on it, that gave working people a tax credit with their state taxes, and we should do that. In Pennsylvania, we tax the bottom 20% of people on the income scale at 15.1% of their income totally. The top 1%, people making an average of $1.9 million a year, they only pay 6% of their income in state and local taxes. We have the highest tax rate on low-income people in the entire country. If we adopted a state version of the Earned Income Tax Credit, it's already passed the House. We're waiting for that to pass the Senate. I hope we'll do it this year. We would knock down taxes for working people, make life a lot easier for them.
I think Mark bringing up the Earned Income Tax Credit, that is, I think, at least a targeted, more strategic policy that focuses on lower income parents and to help them. Interestingly, if you look at the federal EITC, there are Pennsylvanians, even just in Philadelphia, every year the Philadelphia Department of Revenue releases numbers on how many Philadelphians are eligible for the federal Earned Income Tax Credit but don't apply for it. It is tens of thousands of Philadelphians who leave over $100 million of federal tax credits on the table every year. And that's just Philadelphia. That's not counting the rest of the Commonwealth. Again, I think if there was effort and attention paid on trying to connect low-income Philadelphians with some of the existing programs that are there to benefit them, that would be very helpful.
I'm glad to hear Alex supports the earned
See
income tax
that?
credit. Let's set up a meeting together to see Senators Ward and Pittman and tell them we're united on this, and they should move that bill through the Senate.
Well, and again, even if there's not the ability, implementing a state-level EITC is a pretty significant undertaking. Even at a minimum, trying to educate Pennsylvanians on the existing tax credits at the federal level for which they're eligible and not applying would go a long way. But see, I knew we would find some areas of agreement.
Every once in a while we do.
Yeah, of course.
And you know, having a state earned income tax credit would actually give people incentive to apply for the federal credit as well. It would be a win-win. And having it at the state level would kind of remind people that it exists at the federal level, because they'd have to apply for one to get the other. And it's administrative, very, very simple.
Mark, can you talk a little bit about the impact if the minimum wage were to increase? How would that affect other hourly paid wages?
Well, we're pretty clear that a minimum wage of $15 would push people who are making $15, $16, $17 an hour now up, because businesses want to maintain their pay scales and pay some people with more responsible jobs or with more seniority a bit more. So that's why we think minimum wage would affect so many workers. 21% of workers in Pennsylvania would benefit if we went to $15 an hour. It's not just people between 7 and 15, it's also the people above 15. And that has a ripple effect through the economy. If we raise wages for lower income Pennsylvanians, in general, it benefits the economy because they spend everything they make. And that creates more jobs in small businesses and enables them to pay more wages, higher wages to others. It's a good thing, and that's been shown everywhere the states have done that. State economies have benefited when the minimum wage has gone up.
I love the world that Mark lives in. I want to live there, where you can significantly increase labor costs and everyone's wages up the labor scale all go up and everything is perfect. It's just not the reality. You know, we hear from nonprofit organizations, for example, you know, small nonprofits or social service agencies who much of their funding comes from public sources, federal government or state government. You know, these employers, they may not come out and rail against the minimum wage because they know the political pressure that comes with that, but they are extremely concerned about a significant increase in their labor costs, especially when they're already competing with a lot of these corporations who are paying already much higher and competitive wages. They simply don't know how to make their budgets work if you increase wages that dramatically, that quickly. You're talking about very small businesses, you're talking about nonprofits. It is not that simple.
I run a small nonprofit with 10 employees. We've been paying our interns $15 an hour for the last 6 years.
If the minimum wage gets increased, I know, Mark, you addressed this briefly with your pizza example. Alex, I'd like to pose this to you. If minimum wage gets increased, do you think those costs get passed along to the consumers?
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah, I think that's how the economy operates. If you're a small business, if you're a restaurant, you know, money does not grow on trees. If you're being told, especially if the Senate were to pass the House minimum wage bill, and all of a sudden restaurant labor costs increase 320% in a matter of months, it's almost inconceivable to even think about that. Without a doubt, restaurants would have to make pretty dramatic and difficult decisions. Reduction in their workforce, increasing their price consumers at best. We hear from restaurants, those small, you know, pizza shops we kind of take for granted, but take a look at their books someday and think of, you know, answer their question of how they would increase their labor costs that dramatically. So yes, consumer prices do go up, which has a disproportionate impact on lower income Pennsylvanians, and employment reductions, depending on the rate of the increase, depending on at what level, that is a reality. And again, that's coming from the Congressional Budget Office. That's coming from Pennsylvania's Independent Fiscal Office. These are not partisan or groups with any kind of agenda. These are independent entities saying there absolutely is an impact on employment, and you have to be sensitive to that.
We see that. I remember sitting here with someone from the National Federation of Independent Businesses when I first worked to raise the minimum wage 15 years ago, and he said 50,000 jobs would be lost in Pennsylvania within 6 months of raising the minimum wage to, at the time, $7.15 an hour from $5.50. I wish we had a show 6 months after, because we would have seen, no, jobs hadn't been lost, wages had gone up. And that's what happens in the real world, in every state where we do this. Yeah, there's some economic theories say you raise wages, people can't pay, jobs decline. And at some level, that's true. But we have to look at empirical facts, not theories. The empirical facts are we can raise the wage to $15 and maybe even $17, and we won't lose jobs, and people will be better off, because there are two factors here. There's the one factor of how much does the business have to pay its workers. The other factor is how much productivity does it get from those workers. And there's a third factor, how much business do they do? Pizza shop owners going to sell more pizzas. And that's why the empirical fact is Domino's pizzas cost 1.9% more in states with higher minimum wages around Pennsylvania that are 69% higher than our absurdly low minimum wage.
We're going to continue our discussion in just a moment, but first I'd like to give our viewers an opportunity to hear what's coming up on PCN. The PCN Capitol Preview returns tomorrow morning as we discuss the Senate's legislative agenda with Senators Judy Schwenk and Kristen Phillips-Hill. That's tomorrow morning, live at 9 a.m. Tune in as we provide live coverage of the PIAA Swimming and Diving Championships at Bucknell University starting this Wednesday, March 13th until Saturday, March 16th. Live action begins Wednesday afternoon, live starting at 12:15. All the great public affairs event coverage and interviews you watch at PCN are now available for free online at PCNTV.com and on PCN Select. Thank you for watching PCN. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network that receives no government funding. We're relying on viewers and donors like you to help PCN continue to bring you everything Pennsylvania. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. And just a reminder to our viewers, if you would like to join in on our discussion, you can call us toll-free at 1-877-PA6-5001 or text us 717-219-4001. Now, Pennsylvania has a local preemption law that states counties cannot set a minimum wage that's higher than what is state law. Marc, we'll start with you. Talk a little bit about either the benefits or drawbacks of not allowing that preemption law in Pennsylvania.
We've wanted that law to be repealed for a long time. The cost of living varies a great deal from one part of Pennsylvania to another. We have 67 counties. There's a minimum a living wage calculator that the Massachusetts Institute of Technology develops, and they actually show what is the living wage in every county in Pennsylvania, and it's higher than $15 an hour in 43 out of 67 counties for a single worker. It's $16 an hour in 17 counties, including Allegheny. It's $17 an hour in 7 counties, including Philadelphia, and it's all its collar counties, as well as Center and Pike County. Now, I don't know why Pike County has such a high cost of living, but it makes sense if the cost of living is higher in Pike County or Philadelphia or Allegheny County, then let's let them raise the minimum wage a little bit higher. I think what you'd see all of Southeast PA go up to 16 or 17 relatively soon. And, if one county decides, we're going to go to 35, and they find it doesn't work, they'll reduce it. It's another good way to experiment. Instead of relying on outdated economic theories, let's let our counties experiment and see what wage works for them.
I think there's some child care center or nonprofit in southeastern Pennsylvania watching this who's having heart palpitations right now. But, it's an interesting question, this idea of preemption. Generally, we believe that these types of labor and workforce policies, ought to be set at the state level. We have 67 counties, but we also have, thousands of municipalities, townships, boroughs, cities. The idea of each individual local government being able to kind of set their own labor and employment policies and creating this patchwork where you're going to impact employers, businesses that have operations or workplaces in multiple municipalities, becomes administratively impossible but very difficult. And preemption is also kind of in the eye of the beholder. We've talked about preemption as it relates to something like prevailing wage, and do you give school districts or counties the ability to set their own set their own policies when it relates to prevailing wage? And when that comes up, folks say no, you absolutely need statewide policies. So setting policies at the state or local level, I think, no one really cares much about preemption. It's just, do you support the individual policy or not?
We have a question that came in via text. How would the fair share tax plan, which would cause a fourfold tax increase on small business, impact the ability of businesses to pay a higher wage?
Oh, I'm glad you raised our plan. Yeah, it's a plan to make our taxes fair, because as I mentioned, people at the bottom pay at tax rates 2.5 times the people at the very top. What the fair share tax plan would do would basically divide our personal income tax into 2 parts. One would be on wages and interest, where we would call for a lower rate of, our plan calls for 2.8%. The gentleman's talking about another plan, which is a little different than ours. And then we would raise the taxes on income from wealth, dividends, capital gains, small business profits, and so forth, up to 16.5%. Now, that would bring in about $2.8 billion a year to the state, which we could use to fund education, and at the same time cut taxes for 50% of Pennsylvanians. Now, the gentleman who asked the question asked about small businesses. Well, our plan actually has a built-in loophole for very small businesses. That is, someone who owns a very small business can decide to take wages either as business profits, or take income as business profits or as wages. Under our plan, if they took all their income as wages, they'd actually get a tax cut. So for the smallest businesses, our plan actually cuts taxes. And for other businesses, it raises taxes on their income from wealth, but not on other income. And our estimate is that for the richest Pennsylvanians, they would still be paying under our plan 2 to 3% less of their income in taxes than in every state around us except for Ohio.
Well, I think the questioner is referring to a proposal that has been put forth, and there was a hearing of the House Finance Committee last week that does create several options. One of which is a threefold, 300% increase in taxes on Pennsylvania small businesses. That, of course, is. The idea that policy is being put forth is very concerning. We already struggle as a Commonwealth to attract businesses here. Pennsylvania, according to a study last year from the Kauffman Institute, we were the worst state in the country for entrepreneurship, of opening new businesses. The Department of Labor did an analysis looking at how many businesses were started or moved into a state, offset by the number of businesses that moved out or closed down in the state. And Pennsylvania was the 5th worst state in the country. We have a real competitiveness problem in the Commonwealth of encouraging employers to start, to grow, to operate, and to stay in Pennsylvania. And that has long-term implications with our state budget, with our economy. The idea that lawmakers would contemplate, tripling a small business's taxes, I think is completely contrary to what should be a pro-growth, agenda in Harrisburg.
If many typically minimum wage paying jobs, such as, say, fast food places, are now paying $12 or $14 or $15 an hour, does the minimum wage still matter?
Yeah, it does, because they're not all doing that. A lot of businesses are still paying below 15, and because the other point that you and I talked about just a minute ago, people making $15 an hour would see their wages go up if we set a minimum wage of 15, because they've been in jobs longer and they have seniority, they're more productive, the employers want to reward them, and they would accordingly adjust their wages up. So we estimate 21% of Pennsylvanians would benefit from a $15 minimum wage.
How do you determine what the appropriate rate should be?
You do it in terms of looking at history, for one thing, and that's why I mentioned 1968 and what the minimum wage would be today if we set it at the level of 1968. 1968 was a booming economy. It was the last time we had unemployment rates down at the level we have right now, which is one reason I picked that year, besides the fact it was the first year I worked. And so it's a good comparison. The minimum wage at that time was about 50% of the average wage. Now it's down to 25% of the average wage. So there's plenty of room to raise the minimum wage and have a growing economy, growing faster than today, without inflation. And we know that because we've done it. We did it in 1968.
It is interesting whenever there's a discussion about kind of tracking the minimum wage with inflation. Coincidentally, the year 1968 is always referenced because that's when the minimum wage hit its inflationary high point. If you look at the minimum wage over time, if you look at the minimum wage when it was first instituted back in the 30s and tracked that to inflation, I think it'd be around $5 or so. So you can kind of pick your year. I think what you focus on, look at the ages, look at the individuals who were earning minimum wage back in 1968, and you will find they were significantly older and significantly more poor. When we look at the minimum wage today, this study from the State Department of Labor and Industry I referenced, it showed that 36% of minimum wage earners last year, 36% lived in households in which family income exceeded $150,000 a year. So that's not to say that's all of them. It's 36%, but it's a meaningful portion. Again, this is a blunt instrument, and we need much more targeted solutions.
Let's take a call from one of our viewers now. Robert is calling from Clearfield. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, good morning, folks. Gentlemen, doesn't it really come down to this? If a company has to be dependent on workers, he said, working for starvation wages and has to be subsidized in terms of public social program benefits, why should that company even be allowed to continue in business? If they're not going to make it after a while anyhow, so if they can't, he said, pay a living wage, what social benefit, economic or social benefit, are they by just being allowed to stay in business? That's why you need to get that minimum wage up there to at least people have a chance to survive economically, and if that company can't make it, well, they'll just have to move on to something else. That's my question. Thanks very much.
I think Robert makes a good point. We subsidize businesses that pay starvation wages with our tax dollars for SNAP benefits, for Medicaid benefits. One of the benefits of raising the minimum wage is state spending on those programs would go down, and that would save us all tax money. So I think that's a very good point. It's I don't want to see anyone go out of business, because I think in many of those cases, those and they wouldn't, because many of those businesses would benefit from raising the minimum wage, because we'd create a level playing field that allowed them to pay more without losing to competitors.
You know, I think in some cases you have employers who are not, who are performing a social service or a public service in their regions. These are, as I said before, these are nonprofits. These are agencies where, their revenue is fixed, is determined by public sources, and they don't really have the latitude to make those changes. They're not really sure what they're going to do if the minimum wage is increased to that extent. And again, I understand the purpose of talking about starvation wages, but again, if you look at who's earning the minimum wage, it is a much more complicated story. And when you say that, over a third, 36%, are in households with $150,000. It is at least more complicated than it is being portrayed when you have high school kids or people working kind of part-time jobs for some extra cash for a small business that's struggling every day to keep the lights on and to make payroll. The story is certainly more complicated than just corporations paying starvation wages.
If neighboring states are functioning with a higher minimum wage right now, what else are they doing to support small businesses?
Well, you have across the board states with much more competitive policies for small businesses than Pennsylvania, and all businesses for that matter, whether it's their tax code, how their taxes are operated. Pennsylvania has this tax on startups, where we make it much more difficult for new businesses to offset their losses compared to other states. Our regulatory and permitting, we give credit to the Shapiro administration for focusing very early on our permitting systems in Pennsylvania, but there's so much more work to be done. Pennsylvania has a lot going for us in terms of being attractive to businesses. Sometimes we get in our own way as it relates to policies and programs to make Pennsylvania business friendly, but we hope we can keep heading in a better direction.
Alex's attitude towards the minimum wage reminds me of people's attitudes towards higher education. They complain in Pennsylvania that we don't have many students going to college, yet we have the highest tuition in the entire country. So you create a policy that to kill an institution, then you blame the institution for not working. You don't raise the minimum wage for $15. You have it worth half of what it was in 1968. And then you say, oh, it's only teenagers who benefit from the minimum wage. Well, yeah, if you're going to kill a policy, it's not going to work. If we set the minimum wage at the reasonable level it was throughout our history, and by the way, when the minimum wage was created in 1938, it was 25 cents an hour, but that was half of the average wage. Now we're down to 25% of the average wage. Of course, the policy isn't going to be as dramatically effective when we don't set it at a proper level.
Mark, can you talk us through where this proposal is in the legislature right now? A bill passed the House and it sits in Senate committee. What other proposals are out there right now?
The proposal that passed the House would have raised the minimum wage to $15 over 2 years and would have set a higher tip minimum wage. Now, I'd like to get rid of the tip minimum wage entirely, but that's a step forward. And I think would have had a cost of living increase. That was a proposal that was originally introduced in the Senate by a senator from Erie County. And the House said, okay, if someone in the Senate wants this, we'll pass that, and now it's your turn to do it. But so far, that bill's gone nowhere in the Senate.
You know, it's interesting. The tip minimum wage sort of goes under the radar, but when you look at the impact on the economy, on workers, on employers, it's possibly the piece of this that makes the most impact. Washington, D.C. just passed legislation to eliminate the tip credit, the tip minimum wage for their restaurants. Washington, D.C. for years has seen a steady growth in employment in the restaurant sector. Again, great for workers, great for businesses. They passed legislation to eliminate the tip credit. All of a sudden, employment is reduced in Washington, D.C.'s restaurant sector. Again, that means fewer job opportunities for individuals. That means fewer part-time jobs, fewer jobs for kids. You know, again, Mark's a very smart guy. You tell me how a diner in Clearfield or how, a bar in Allentown where I grew up, and you're telling them they have to raise their labor costs by over 500%. By next year or in a couple years, I don't understand how you make those numbers work. So I think these are well-intended but seriously misguided policies. You have in the legislature a bill that passed the House, mostly along party lines. The Senate, has a number of proposals that they're looking at, and we just hope that if the minimum wage is increased, it's perhaps balanced with policies that will actually make Pennsylvania a better place to do business.
So I don't know where Alex is getting this 500% number. First, you tell me that most workers make more than $7.25 now, which is true. So they're like $11 or $12. So going from $11 or $12 an hour to $15 an hour in the restaurant industry is not going to kill people. It's just not.
We can do a minimum wage 101 as it relates to the tip credit, but you're talking an over 500% increase for many restaurants, and this is a system that has been pretty universally agreed to for years. That says restaurants are a unique industry. They operate on razor-thin profit margins. We need a system that both takes care of workers, acknowledges that many of the employees are tipped, and make sure the restaurants can stay in business. And the notion of completely eliminating that system that has worked very well for both workers and for employers for many years is very concerning.
Marc Stier, Alex Halper, that'll have to be it. Thank you both for joining us, gentlemen. And earlier today, I'd spoken with Donna Greco from the American Cancer Society's Cancer Action Network about how the governor's budget proposal would affect those affected by cancer. We're joined today by Donna Greco, Government Relations Director for the Pennsylvania chapter of the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. So we're here today to talk about Governor Shapiro's budget proposals, particularly how it may affect those whose lives have been touched by cancer. But before we dig into that, can you give our viewers just a quick thumbnail sketch of what the American Cancer Society's Cancer Action Network does?
Yes, thank you so much. We are a volunteer-driven organization, and we work to make sure that every person can prevent, detect, treat, and survive cancer throughout Pennsylvania and nationally. So we work together in every state. We're here in Pennsylvania working alongside volunteers, lawmakers, partners, advocates to make that mission possible for all Pennsylvanians.
One of Governor Shapiro's proposals would provide $4 million toward wiping out $400 million in medical debt. How significant of a burden is medical debt, particularly for those dealing with cancer?
It is definitely a concern for people with cancer when you think about the multiple providers, the many office visits, the different forms of treatment and care, the cost of prescription drugs, transportation, lodging, time away from work to get treatment. It is very costly, and we at the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network are very pleased to see a proposal to reduce Pennsylvanians' medical debt. We don't feel that any person, regardless of their income, should have to choose between life-saving treatment and basic needs like feeding their family or, keeping a roof overhead.
Are you aware of instances where perhaps somebody with a cancer diagnosis either delayed care or perhaps received a lower level of care than recommended because of financial concerns?
Yes, financial concerns are significant barriers for people in accessing, even preventative screening care. So if you think about if you're afraid to pay a bill for screening that allows you to detect cancer early and access, more effective treatment sooner, let alone, going in for the more costly forms of care. So it's definitely a significant concern in Pennsylvania and nationally. We recently did a study of survivor voices at the American Cancer Society, and medical debt is among the top concerns, and also connecting to food insecurity for many cancer patients.
Are you aware of examples of how medical debt relief has worked in other states to help families?
That is something that we're really learning and very curious about. It seems like a really important opportunity. We know that in other states there are bills pending, also looking at budget investments, looking at the affordability of prescription drugs and addressing medical debt, paired with that concern. So we're really eager to review various paths to reducing this debt for Pennsylvania.
The governor's proposals also includes $2.5 million toward the Pennsylvania Breast Cancer and Cervical Cancer Early Detection Program. How much has this program benefited individuals who perhaps received an early diagnosis so that they were able to treat at an early stage?
Yeah, this program serves approximately 30,000 people each year, and this really enables underinsured and uninsured Pennsylvanians to access that preventative early detection screening that they otherwise might not be able to afford. So again, it goes to prevention, more effective treatment, survival, and really thriving in their lives, and reducing those barriers to screening and early detection.
Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of screening and early detection?
It is so important. Over the past several decades, we've really seen a decline in cancer-related deaths, and most of that is due to reduction in tobacco use as well as screening and early detection. Despite those strides that we've made, though, we anticipate in 2024 that we're going to hit over 2 million new cancer diagnoses in the country, and in Pennsylvania, around 90,000 new cancer diagnoses just here in 2024. So that early detection, that early screening allows you to catch cancer early, which allows you to get that effective treatment sooner, and you have better chances before the disease progresses.
Governor Shapiro's budget also funds tobacco prevention and cessation programs. Can you talk a little bit about the link between tobacco being a cancer-causing agent?
Yeah, this really can be viewed as a comprehensive package. We're talking about prevention, early detection, and access with the three proposals. So the tobacco cessation and prevention program is really around prevention and stopping the next generation of tobacco addiction. It really helps people make healthier choices, and it also helps people who currently smoke, reduce smoking and to ultimately quit, which really saves lives. We know in Pennsylvania, around 30% of cancer-related deaths are due to tobacco consumption.
Is there data to show that the tobacco prevention and cessation programs are yielding reduced tobacco use in Pennsylvania?
They are. There are multiple programs funded through the Department of Health around the state, and they're really grounded in best practices in prevention and cessation, guided by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and really making strides in reducing the impact and reducing the availability and the marketing of tobacco products.
What will the American Cancer Society's Pennsylvania chapter do to really show support and endorse these proposals that have been put forth in the budget?
Yeah, we are gathering on May 7th at the Capitol for Cancer Action Day, and we'll be talking with lawmakers and partners and volunteers and advocates about these 3 proposals. And we're really looking forward to working with lawmakers, with the governor's office and other partners in addressing these barriers to cancer prevention, treatment, and survival.
Donna Greco, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
That concludes today's show. On the next episode of the PCN Capitol Preview, we'll discuss the Senate's legislative agenda. That's tomorrow starting at 9 a.m. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.